January 30th, 1944. The Philippine Sea was quiet on the surface, but 180 feet below it, tension was thick enough to suffocate a man. In the narrow conning tower of the submarine USS Seahorse stood a commander who understood that in the next few minutes he and his crew might simply disappear into the dark ocean forever. The officer's name was Slade Cutter. For nearly 80 relentless hours, he had stalked the same Japanese convoy like a shadow that refused to fade. 3 freighters moved steadily through the water, while 7 escort destroyers guarded them like wolves protecting prey. Cutter had already fired his torpedoes once. One of the freighters had erupted in a violent explosion that tore its stern apart, sending hundreds of soldiers screaming into the freezing black water. But the moment that ship disappeared beneath the waves, the entire situation flipped. Every destroyer in the convoy instantly turned toward the submarine's position. 7 warships, hundreds of depth charges, hundreds of explosions waiting to crush a submarine like a soda can. Cutter had only 8 torpedoes remaining. His batteries were draining. His exhausted crew had barely slept in 3 days. The destroyers were charging toward him at 35 knots, while the submarine's maximum underwater speed was only 9. The math was simple, brutal, and unforgiving. By every standard calculation of submarine warfare during World War II, he should have been dead already. Statistics from the war were merciless. When multiple destroyers coordinated their attack patterns against a submarine, survival was rare. Almost every submarine caught in that situation ended up crushed by explosives or forced to surface into gunfire. Cutter was now trapped in exactly that nightmare. Beneath him, the coral reefs near Palau Islands waited 400 feet down. Above him, the surface was 180 feet away. Surrounding him from every direction were destroyers whose sonar systems were already searching for metallic echo of his submarine's hull. He was trapped in a 3-dimensional kill box made of explosives. Standard doctrine for submarine commanders was simple. Dive deeper, shut down every sound, and pray the enemy ships passed overhead without noticing. Most captains followed that rule without hesitation. Cutter did something that seemed completely insane. Instead of running away, he ordered the submarine to turn directly toward the closest destroyer and accelerate at full speed. That moment would become one of the most audacious decisions in the entire Pacific submarine war. Over the next 48 hours, Cutter would turn a desperate escape into a relentless hunt. He would destroy additional ships from the same convoy, while enemy destroyers hunted him almost continuously. His submarine would endure more than 100 depth charge explosions that shook the steel hull like a drum. At night, he would surface only briefly to recharge batteries, while enemy warships searched the surrounding sea just a few miles away. In a situation where survival alone would have been considered a miracle, Cutter somehow managed to turn the hunters into the hunted. What made the story even more unbelievable was that only a few years earlier many officers in the United States Navy doubted whether Cutter should command anything at all. Slade Cutter's life had begun far from the ocean. He was born in 1911 in the quiet farming town of Oswego, Illinois. It was a place where strength was measured not by military victories, but by how much work a man could do in the fields. His father had once been a talented athlete, but suffered a permanent injury while playing football, which made the family cautious about sports. Because of that accident, Cutter's mother pushed him towards something very different from the rough physical life of most farm boys. She encouraged him to learn music. Young Slade chose the flute and practiced with an intensity that surprised everyone around him. By the time he was 16, he had become so skilled that he won a national competition judged by the famous composer John Philip Sousa. For a moment, it looked as though his life might move toward music rather than war. Everything changed when he entered the United States Naval Academy in 1931. Cutter arrived with an unusual list of personal habits written on his entrance paperwork: tobacco, swearing, and flute playing. But his large frame made him impossible to ignore. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing more than 200 pounds, he quickly attracted attention from the Academy's football coach. That coach was Paul Brown, the legendary strategist who would later become famous in professional football. Brown took one look at Cutter and told him he would be playing on the team. Cutter protested that he had never played football before in his life. Brown simply replied that practice began on Monday. Within a few years, Cutter had transformed from a musical student into one of the Academy's strongest players. By 1934, he had become an All-American tackle playing both offense and defense during an era when players rarely left the field. His most famous moment came during the legendary Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. Rain had turned the stadium into a muddy swamp. Nearly 80,000 spectators watched as the score remained locked at 0 late in the final quarter. Navy's coach decided to attempt a field goal even though the field conditions were terrible. Cutter, normally a lineman, stepped forward to take the kick. The ball sank several inches into the mud before he struck it. The kick looked awkward and unstable, wobbling through the air before barely clearing the crossbar. Yet it counted. Navy won the game 3-0, and the stadium exploded in celebration. Overnight, Cutter became a national sports hero. Professional boxing promoters quickly approached him with offers that could have made him wealthy for life. Instead of chasing fame, he chose something far more dangerous. Cutter reported for duty aboard the battleship USS Idaho BB-42. War clouds were already gathering around the world, and Cutter believed the Navy would soon need every capable officer it could find. In 1938, he entered submarine training in Connecticut, a program known for its intense psychological pressure. Many trainees discovered that life inside a sealed steel vessel deep underwater was unbearable. Some quit within weeks. Cutter thrived in the environment and graduated at the top of his class. He later explained that the lessons he learned playing football had prepared him for that pressure. To him, stress was simply another opponent to defeat. When the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into World War II, Cutter was already serving as an officer aboard the submarine USS Pompon, SS-267. His commander was the aggressive submarine Captain Lewis S. Parks. On their first war patrol, the crew immediately discovered how chaotic wartime operations could become. A U.S. patrol aircraft mistakenly identified their submarine as Japanese and called in dive bombers from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, CV-6. Bomb explosions damaged Pompon's fuel tanks and left a trail of oil behind the submarine that could easily guide enemy ships straight to them. Yet the patrol continued into enemy-controlled waters. During that mission, Cutter witnessed his first deadly submarine attack. Pompon located a large Japanese transport ship and fired a spread of torpedoes from extremely close range. All of them struck the target, and the massive vessel rolled over and sank within minutes. But victory was immediately followed by danger when a Japanese destroyer appeared. Parks ordered a daring maneuver known as a down-the-throat attack, pointing the submarine directly at the charging warship and firing torpedoes head-on. The gamble nearly ended in disaster when early torpedo detonations shook the submarine violently. Depth charges followed, flooding part of the vessel and pushing it dangerously close to the ocean floor. Cutter coordinated emergency repairs that saved the submarine from destruction. From that experience, he absorbed a lesson that would define the rest of his career. Bold aggression, when executed correctly, could actually be safer than hesitation. That philosophy would soon make him one of the most feared submarine commanders in the Pacific. When he finally took command of USS Seahorse in 1943, Cutter brought with him a mindset that ignored caution and embraced calculated risk. His crew did not yet realize that their captain was about to rewrite the rules of submarine warfare. And as the Seahorse silently approached enemy convoys in the vast Pacific Ocean, the story of Slade Cutter was only just beginning to unfold. For Slade Cutter, commanding the submarine USS Seahorse was never going to be an ordinary assignment. From the very beginning, he treated submarine warfare less like a cautious underwater patrol and more like a high-stakes chess match where bold moves often decided the outcome. The Pacific Ocean during World War II had already become one of the most dangerous battlefields on Earth. Japanese convoys moved constantly between occupied islands, carrying troops, ammunition, fuel, and food that kept the Empire's military machine alive. For the United States Navy, submarines became the silent predators responsible for cutting those lifelines. But hunting convoys was never simple. Merchant ships rarely traveled alone. They were guarded by destroyers equipped with sonar and armed with depth charges capable of crushing a submarine hundreds of feet underwater. One mistake, one sound too loud, or one torpedo fired too early could expose a submarine's position and turn the hunter into the hunted. Cutter understood those risks better than most officers, but he believed something else even more strongly. Hesitation often killed submariners faster than aggression. That mindset shaped every patrol Seahorse undertook under his command. Early in his leadership, he gathered the crew and made something very clear. He told them that the submarine existed for one purpose: to attack enemy shipping as relentlessly as possible. The crew quickly learned that their captain expected absolute focus and discipline. Every sonar operator, torpedo technician, and navigator had to perform perfectly because Cutter planned to push the submarine into situations where mistakes would mean instant disaster. His philosophy soon produced results. During one patrol in the waters near the South China Sea, Seahorse detected a Japanese convoy moving slowly through heavy rain clouds at limited visibility. The convoy included multiple cargo ships escorted by destroyers, zigzagging through the waves to make torpedo attacks more difficult. Many submarine captains would have waited patiently for darkness before approaching closer. Cutter did the opposite. He ordered Seahorse to move into attack position while the convoy was still fully alert. The submarine crept forward silently beneath the waves, while sonar operators tracked the rhythmic pulse of propellers above them. When the moment came, Cutter lined up a spread of torpedoes aimed at the largest transport ship in the convoy. The tension inside the submarine became unbearable as the crew waited for command to fire. When it finally came, several torpedoes streaked through the water toward their target. Seconds later, the ocean erupted with violent explosions as the torpedoes slammed into the hull of the cargo ship. Flames shot into the sky as the vessel began to break apart. But triumph lasted only a moment before the escorting destroyers reacted instantly. Their engines roared as they turned directly toward the spot where the torpedoes had originated. Inside Seahorse, alarms sounded while Cutter ordered the submarine to dive deeper. The crew could hear the destroyers racing overhead, their sonar pulses echoing to the hull like a mechanical heartbeat searching for them. Then the first depth charge exploded. The shock wave slammed into the submarine, rattling pipes and shaking electrical panels. Another explosion followed, then another. Soon the ocean around them felt like it was being torn apart by underwater thunder. Depth charges detonated close enough to knock crew members off their feet. Lights flickered as dust and paint flakes drifted through the narrow compartments. Yet Cutter remained calm, issuing quiet orders while the submarine maneuvered carefully to slip away from the attackers. For hours, the destroyers continued their hunt. Every few minutes, another explosion shook the submarine as enemy ships dropped more depth charges into the sea. The crew could feel the pressure building with each detonation, as if the ocean itself was trying to crush them. Many sailors later admitted they believed the submarine would never escape. But Cutter's patience and precise maneuvering eventually paid off. By moving slowly and minimizing every possible sound, Seahorse gradually slipped beyond the reach of the destroyer's sonar. When the final explosions faded into the distance, the crew realized they were still alive. Experiences like that forged an unbreakable bond between Cutter and his crew. They knew their captain demanded courage, but they also understood he possessed the skill to guide them to the most dangerous situations imaginable. As patrol after patrol continued, Seahorse began building a reputation throughout the submarine fleet. Reports from intelligence officers showed that the submarine was sinking enemy ships at a remarkable pace. Japanese supply lines were slowly weakening as more cargo vessels disappeared beneath the waves. But Cutter's most famous test was still approaching. It would begin in January 1944, when Seahorse located a heavily defended convoy near the Palau Islands. 3 large freighters were traveling together under protection of 7 destroyers, forming a defensive ring around the valuable transports. It was exactly the kind of formation that submarines were usually ordered to avoid. The odds of surviving an attack against so many escorts were extremely small. Yet Cutter saw something different when he studied the convoy through the periscope. He saw opportunity. For nearly 80 hours, Seahorse followed the convoy through open ocean. Cutter refused to rush the attack, choosing instead to observe the movement of the escort ships and memorize their patrol patterns. The submarine surfaced briefly at night to recharge its batteries while staying just far enough away to avoid detection. The crew slept in short shifts while the tension slowly built. Everyone understood that when the attack finally came, it would trigger an intense response from the destroyers guarding the convoy. The moment arrived late on the night of January 30th. Cutter maneuvered Seahorse into perfect firing position and launched a spread of torpedoes. Seconds later, a massive explosion ripped through one of the freighters. Flames erupted as the ship's stern shattered, and the vessel began sinking rapidly into the dark water. But that success instantly revealed the submarine's presence. The 7 destroyers guarding the convoy turned toward the attack point like a pack of wolves suddenly spotting their prey. Cutter now faced the exact situation every submarine commander feared most: multiple enemy warships charging toward his position with sonar and depth charges ready. Inside Seahorse, the crew waited for their captain's decision. Standard procedure demanded an immediate deep dive and silent escape. But Slade Cutter had never been a man who followed ordinary procedures when something bolder might work. As the destroyers closed in at full speed, Cutter gave an order that stunned the officers around him. Instead of running away from the approaching warships, he commanded the submarine to turn directly toward them. The Seahorse accelerated through the water, heading straight at the nearest destroyer. In that moment, Cutter was gambling not only with his own life, but with the lives of every man aboard the submarine. Yet his reasoning was simple and brilliant. Destroyers expected submarines to flee. Their sonar operators were already searching behind the attack point where an escaping submarine would normally be hiding. By moving forward instead of backward, Seahorse might slip directly through the enemy formation before the destroyers realized what happened. It was a maneuver so daring that very few commanders would have attempted it. As Seahorse raced forward to the darkness beneath the waves, the destroyers above prepared their weapons, completely unaware that the submarine they were hunting was now moving straight toward them. The next few minutes would determine whether Cutter's bold strategy would become a legendary success or a fatal mistake that would send the submarine and its crew to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean forever. He saw their children with round faces and clean clothes running beside bicycles and wagons full of groceries. Herman blinked several times, trying to clear his mind. For years he had been told that ordinary Americans lived in poverty while the rich few controlled everything. Yet what he saw here looked nothing like the propaganda posters or speeches he had heard back home. Instead of starving citizens and desperate workers, he saw people laughing, chatting, and moving with an easy confidence that puzzled him deeply. And he wasn't the only German prisoner who felt that confusion. As more prisoners stepped off the transport trucks and trains arriving at American camps, the same silent question appeared on their faces. If America was supposedly collapsing under capitalism, why did everything here seem so normal? Inside the camp gates, the prisoners expected harsh discipline and brutal guards. Instead, they were met with something completely different. American soldiers gave them clear instructions, but without shouting. They were directed to barracks that, while simple, were clean and organized. Rows of wooden beds stood neatly arranged with real mattresses, blankets, and pillows. After years of war and the rough conditions many soldiers had experienced on the front lines, the sight alone felt almost unreal. Some men touched the mattresses cautiously, as if expecting them to disappear. But the biggest shock came during their first meal in the mess hall. Long tables were already set. Metal trays were filled with food that looked far better than what many German civilians were receiving back home at that time. Bread, potatoes, vegetables, and even meat appeared on the plates. One prisoner later remembered the moment clearly. He had stared at the tray for several seconds before eating, unsure whether it was some kind of test. Another soldier whispered that the Americans must be fattening them up before something terrible happened. But nothing terrible came. The guards simply waited patiently while the prisoners ate. News spread quickly through the camp. German prisoners were allowed to receive letters. They could write home. Some camps even organized sports games and music nights. Soccer matches became popular, with prisoners forming teams and competing against one another. At first, many Germans refused to believe it was genuine kindness. They suspected the Americans were trying to manipulate them or collect information. Yet week after week, the same pattern continued. The guards followed the rules set by the Geneva Convention, treating the prisoners not as enemies to be destroyed, but as soldiers who had simply lost a battle. Herman Butcher spent his first weeks carefully observing everything around him. He noticed that the American guards did not seem to fear the prisoners the way German guards had feared Allied captives in Europe. They talked casually, sometimes even joking among themselves. Trucks arrived regularly bringing supplies, food, clothing, and tools for work programs that allowed prisoners to help on farms or in small local industries. Farmers in Alabama and other states often needed labor because many American men were fighting overseas. German prisoners filled that gap. The work details created even more surprises. When prisoners were taken outside the camp to help with harvest, they saw American towns up close. They saw grocery stores full of products, clothing shops with displays and windows, and gas stations serving lines of civilian cars. One prisoner later wrote in his diary that the shelves in an American supermarket looked more abundant than anything he had seen in Germany even before the war began. At first, some prisoners tried to defend the propaganda they had believed. They insisted that these towns must be special areas created only for show. But as months passed and prisoners were moved between camps across different states, Texas, Kansas, Arizona, New York, the same pattern appeared everywhere. Ordinary Americans seemed to live comfortably. They complained about rationing and war sacrifices, but their lives still looked far more stable than what German civilians were experiencing under constant bombing and shortages. Slowly, the psychological impact began to spread. The prisoners talked late at night in their barracks, discussing what they had seen. Some remained loyal to Nazi ideology, insisting that Germany would still win the war. Others began quietly questioning everything they had been taught since childhood. If the propaganda about America was wrong, what else might be wrong too? One evening, Herman sat outside his barracks, watching the sunset over the Alabama countryside. The sky glowed orange above the trees, and somewhere in the distance he could hear laughter from American workers finishing their shift nearby. It was a peaceful moment, something he had not experienced in years. For the first time since the war began, Herman felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. He was still a prisoner, but he was also safe, well-fed, and treated with a level of dignity he never expected from the enemy. Yet none of the prisoners realized that the biggest transformation was still ahead, because the longer they stayed in America, the more they would discover that life there contradicted almost everything Nazi leaders had told them. And those discoveries would eventually travel back to Germany itself, carried by letters, memories, and stories that would challenge the foundations of the propaganda machine. Weeks slowly turned into months, and life inside the American prison camps began to follow a strange but steady rhythm. What once felt shocking gradually became routine for many of the German prisoners. Every morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast and then work assignments. Some prisoners remained inside the camp maintaining buildings, cooking meals, or cleaning equipment. Others were taken outside under guard to farms, factories, and small construction sites where their labor helped support the American war effort. Yet, what surprised many of them most was not the work itself, but the attitude of the Americans they met along the way. Farmers often spoke to the prisoners through translators or simple gestures. Some even offered them extra fruit, vegetables, or cold water during long hours in the fields. For men who had expected cruelty and hatred, these small acts created deep confusion. Many prisoners had grown up hearing that Americans were selfish capitalists who cared only about money. But here they were seeing ordinary people treating captured enemy soldiers with a level of patience and even kindness that didn't fit the image they had been taught. Herman Butcher noticed another change happening quietly among the prisoners. In the early weeks after their arrival, many German soldiers had remained fiercely loyal to Nazi ideology. They spoke proudly about Germany's eventual victory and repeated the propaganda they had memorized during their training. But as time passed, those conversations slowly began to shift. The longer they lived in America, the harder it became to ignore the contrast between propaganda and reality. One of the most powerful influences came from education programs organized inside the camps. American authorities allowed prisoners to attend classes where they could learn English, mathematics, engineering basics, and even political history. Books were made available in small camp libraries. Newspapers sometimes circulated among prisoners as well. At first, many refused to read them, convinced they were nothing more than enemy propaganda. But curiosity eventually overcame suspicion. Herman remembered the day he first opened an American newspaper. The headline spoke openly about political debates, military setbacks, and criticism of government decisions. It shocked him deeply. In Germany, newspapers were tightly controlled and filled almost entirely with government-approved messages. Seeing a newspaper that openly discussed problems and disagreements felt almost unbelievable. Some prisoners whispered that such openness would never be allowed in their homeland. The psychological shift did not happen overnight. In fact, The camps themselves sometimes became divided between different groups of prisoners. Hardline Nazi supporters tried to maintain strict loyalty to Hitler's ideology. They pressured other prisoners to remain committed to cause, and sometimes even threatened those who appeared too friendly with American guards or too interested in the educational programs. In some camps, these internal tensions became serious enough that American authorities had to separate the most radical prisoners from the others to prevent violence. But despite those tensions, many prisoners slowly began changing the way they viewed the world. Some started learning English seriously, hoping it might help them after the war. Others focused on practical skills like mechanics or carpentry that could be useful in rebuilding their lives someday. For the first time in years, the constant pressure of frontline combat was gone. Instead of surviving from one battle to the next, the prisoners now had time to think. Outside the camps, the war itself was beginning to shift dramatically. Allied forces were advancing across Europe and the Pacific. News of German defeat spread slowly among the prisoners through rumors and official announcements. Each new report weakened the belief that Germany would somehow turn the tide and win the war. The realization was painful for many soldiers who had once believed completely in their country's unstoppable strength. One evening, Herman sat again outside the barracks, watching another quiet sunset across the Alabama landscape. By now the view had become familiar. The fields, the distant farmhouses, and the calm rhythm of life around the camp no longer felt like something temporary or unreal. Instead, it had become part of daily existence. As he thought about the war, Herman realized something that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The enemy he had been taught to hate did not look like monsters. They looked like ordinary people living ordinary lives. That realization created a deep internal conflict. Herman still loved his homeland and worried about his family back in Germany, who were now living under constant bombing raids and severe shortages. Yet at the same time, he could no longer deny what he had seen with his own eyes. The world was more complicated than the simple stories he had grown up believing. And then, in the spring of 1945, everything changed. One morning the prisoners were gathered together and given news that many of them had secretly expected but still struggled to accept. Germany had collapsed. Adolf Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe was effectively over. The announcement spread to the camp like a shockwave. Some prisoners stood silently, staring at the ground. Others looked confused, as if the reality had not yet reached them. A few wept quietly. For years they believed they were fighting for a powerful empire destined to dominate Europe. Now that empire had vanished almost overnight. In its place remained uncertainty, fear for their families, and the realization that the world they once knew no longer existed. Yet for many of the prisoners in American camps, another surprising thought soon followed that moment of shock. They were still alive. They had survived the war. And thanks to their time in America, they were about to return to a completely new Germany with experiences and ideas that would shape how they rebuilt their country in the years to come. In many ways, the camps had become an unusual classroom. Instead of simply holding enemy soldiers until the war ended, they had unintentionally exposed those soldiers to the values and daily realities of another society. That exposure planted questions in the minds of thousands of men who would soon return home and begin rebuilding their lives. On the day Herman finally prepared to leave the camp, he walked one last time along the familiar path between the barracks and the fence line. The place that once felt like the end of his world had gradually become a place of reflection and transformation. He paused for a moment and looked beyond the fence toward the open field stretching across the Alabama countryside. The same peaceful landscape he had first seen with confusion now carried a different meaning. It reminded him that the world was far larger and far more complex than the simple stories told during wartime. When the trucks finally arrived to take the prisoners away, many climbed aboard quietly, carrying with them memories they would never forget. They had come to America expecting cruelty and hardship. Instead, they found something that challenged everything they believed, and that experience would stay with them long after the war ended. Stories like this remind us that history is never just about battles, weapons, or victories. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen far away from the front lines, in places where enemies learn unexpected lessons about each other, and where the future begins quietly taking shape. If you found this story interesting and want to hear more powerful and little-known stories from history, Make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey into the past, because history still holds thousands of incredible stories waiting to be discovered.